Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or simply hoping to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney Wilkinson and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the relationship, or the presumed relationship, between violence and media.
It's not only presumed, it's suggested.
Right.
It is proposed. That's the word. It's proposed.
I might go so far as to say it's assumed.
Well, yeah. Well, let's talk about this. Is really an important issue. It's important for two reasons. One is that people today, parents today, parents today are concerned about the effects of violent video games. They call them first-person shooter games. Things like Call of Duty. You have all the military games like Call of Duty, and you also have the crime games like Grand Theft Auto. And so these are called first-person shooter games. There's violence in the movies, violence on TV, cartoon violence, and now video game violence. And people have always been concerned about the relationship between watching and participating, interacting with violent video games, and what is perceived to be an increase in aggressive behavior, violent behavior, and mass shootings. Right. So that's one. Is there a relationship? The second thing is that, and the reason this bothers me is that 2 weeks ago today was the shooting in Parkland, and every time there's a shooting, the same issues are raised. And one of those issues is, well, there's something wrong with our culture, or there's something wrong. It's about violent video games. The governor of Kentucky did a long tirade about it's a cultural problem. Right. Wayne LaPierre and other gun control opponents always shift to its violent video games. And the reason it's a concern to me as a psychologist is that if we're looking for the real causes, then let's do the research, let's do the studies, let's do the analysis that leads to those causes. Whenever anybody says, let's talk about video games, and I think the best way that one person put it was, Wayne LaPierre, who's a spokesman for the NRA, wants to blame. He doesn't want to talk about real guns. He wants to talk about toy guns. Right. Okay. That toy guns are the problem. Toy guns in video games. So it's toy guns that are the problem, not real guns that are the problem. That's the second reason I'm interested in this. That if there is a relationship, let's do something about it. If there isn't a relationship, let's move on to what's really at the bottom of mass shootings. Right.
Yeah. So if we look at history, we've been talking about the role of video games, or the potential influence, or the presumed risk of or influence of video games and music and movies and media in general on violence for a long time. I mean, it was proposed and mentioned after Columbine, so in '98. So I mean, almost 20 years ago.
That's right. And I had students at the University of Texas in the '90s who were doing doctoral dissertations on the relationship between violent video games and subsequent aggressive behavior. Right. So this has been around for a while.
It's been around for a long time, and we'll get to the research in just a second, but the research is pretty consistent.
It's stunning.
Right.
In its consistency.
Right.
I mean, even I was shocked because this isn't an area where we follow carefully, regularly. But 1990, so 20 years ago, essentially, this research has been going on for about 20 years.
At least.
And it is amazingly consistent.
Right. And so we're pulling some stuff from an article written by Christopher Ferguson. He's a professor of psychology at Stetson University, and this was from theconversation.com, and the link is in the show notes. But the title is, "It's Time to End the Debate About Video Games and Violence." And it's recent. It was just, he actually published this 2 days after Parkland. So, but again, he kind of outlines some of the research, and it's pretty clear.
Right, and he's one of these. He's been doing research on this topic for 15 years.
Right.
Okay, so this isn't just somebody's opinion.
Right.
So this is a true scholar who knows this area very well and done some of his own research, and he's also analyzed the research of others.
Right.
And he presents some really interesting statistics. The one that I found the most fascinating was that in 2011, the Supreme Court, and you say, well, what does the Supreme Court have to do with it? Apparently, the state of California wanted to somehow restrict violent video games. There was some effort to either restrict them or tax them or something, violent video games. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it became a First Amendment issue. Okay, that does a state have the right to limit violent video games? Well, the Supreme Court in 2011. Now, 2011, that's a conservative court.
Right.
Okay, during the so I think Scalise was still on the court at that time, and in fact, I think he wrote the major opinion about this and said what the Supreme Court concluded was research did not find a clear connection between violent video games and aggressive behavior.
Right.
They did they had experts come in. The Supreme Court weighs these things very carefully. So, well, what about because the Supreme Court is very, very careful in its decisions because their decisions are final.
Right.
So they put a great deal of effort and thought and analysis into any brief that they write.
Right.
And they concluded there's no connection. That was in 2011.
Right.
So for somebody to jump up in 2018, whether you're a governor or a president or the mouthpiece for the NRA, and say, well, there's some connection there, it's because of violent video games. It's not. I mean, and we've known that for years.
Right.
And even the Supreme Court has weighed in on it.
Right.
So how much evidence does a person need?
Right. And I like the way that Dr. Ferguson in this piece, he kind of goes back in time.
Right.
And because I know that, you know, context is important, right?
Right.
So some of these issues have been around since the 1950s.
That's right.
Even when people were complaining about comic books.
That's right.
And in the 1980s, when Tipper Gore was talking about, you know, all of these sort of cultural issues that he thought were, or that was believed to be related to violence.
Yeah, she went on music.
Right.
You know, it was violent music, you know, rap music and violent music and all that, Marilyn Manson and all that. And then they got the blame. Okay.
Right.
So you always have people blaming culture.
Right.
But Elvis Presley was blamed for the demise of our civilization.
Right.
Okay. Now nobody wants to blame him, but in the 50s, parents were scared to death of Elvis Presley and the Beatles.
The Beatles, yeah.
I mean, they were scared to death.
Right.
Long hair, their you know. So, we need to be very careful.
Right. Yeah.
About blaming these cultural things for aggressive behavior and violent behavior.
Right. So in this article, he talks about, and I've read this, some of this meta-analysis that he did
of the
in 2015.
Studies.
Right.
Yeah.
He reviewed 101 studies.
Right. I mean,
and he, as it says in here, I examined 101 studies on the subject and found that violent video games had little impact on kids' aggression, mood, helping behavior, or grades.
That's right. That's right.
So, again, despite the fact that we have consistently shown, there was 101 studies that he just reviewed a couple of years ago.
Right.
That said, very little impact on relationship between these things. We still blame violent video games.
Every time there's a shooting, it comes up.
Right.
Okay. And I just think that it's a diversion. I think they call it a red herring or something. There's some word for it. Where if you don't want to talk about gun control, and we have to talk about gun control.
Right.
If we don't want to talk about gun control, then you talk about everything else. You talk about arming teachers.
Right.
You talk about, this whole good guy with a gun, bad guy with a gun. That was the NRA that's their sentence. That's Wayne LaPierre who made that statement. I'm sorry. I'm not going to voice or agree with Wayne LaPierre on very much. And so this notion that it takes a good guy with a gun, that's simply NRA rhetoric. No, it's Wayne LaPierre rhetoric. 90% of the NRA don't agree with him.
Right.
They're hunters.
Right.
And they contribute to conservation, and they're law-abiding citizens, and they don't have automatic assault rifles.
Right.
So even most of the NRA doesn't agree.
Right.
We know that the country doesn't agree.
Right.
I mean, 60 or 70% of the country doesn't agree with that statement. So, so part of this problem is that they always throw in, because that takes the emphasis off one of the real problems, which is gun control.
Yeah. So we have this lack of evidence creating a connection between violent games, violent movies, and media. And in fact, there was a study done, it's probably been about 10 years now, that was looking at, trying to create connections. What I love about science is that the goal of science is to disprove things, basically.
Right.
I mean, we never...
You don't ever
we never prove
anything.
anything in research. We only disprove.
We try to disprove it because you cannot prove it.
Right.
I mean, unless you're working at like on a farm.
Right.
And you can say, well, we controlled everything except this.
Right.
We controlled everything. We controlled the weather, temperature, light. We controlled everything except the seeds.
Right.
But then you can say, oh, then it must be the seeds.
Right.
But it's only that kind of research where you have that
it's
control.
that level of control, and we just don't have that.
And we don't have that with humans.
World studies, right? So, so research trying to disprove all of this, and it found that violent video games, kids reacted to violent video games. There's that initial reaction with your mood and your behavior.
An individual playing
playing video game. The child's behavior and everything was affected in almost exactly the same way as an adult watching the evening news.
Right.
Because the evening news has a lot of violence and stuff like that in it. And so we try to create this connection. Oh, it must be the video games. Your kids should be watching news and current events, but if you watch news and current events, they react exactly the same way to that.
Right.
So there's not this this causal relationship.
There isn't even a correlation.
Right.
Right. And that's what we always say about research with humans, is all we can say is there's some relationship.
Right.
We can't even find that relationship.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure, because I know you will, if you go out and you search the web for relationship studies that presented a relationship between aggressive behavior and video games, you will find some. However, this is what you have to be cautious of. There's this one well-referenced article that talks about, and he mentions in here about helping behavior and things like that, and aggression. And there was a study done that found that kids who played violent video games tended to be more aggressive.
Right.
And that was their finding. They defined aggression by the kid's willingness to put hot sauce on somebody else's food.
Right. I'm sorry. I'm laughing.
That was how they defined aggression.
One of the things that we do, we were students, and we learned in our doctoral programs how to do research and why you have to be so careful. And then we teach it. Now we're teachers of it, okay? And we understand about how careful you have to be. And when you read these articles and say there's this link there was a study done that showed a connection between A and B, you need to go into that study and see exactly how it was done, because you make a good point.
Right.
Why hot sauce on other kids' foods? Is that how you really define aggressive behavior? Or are you thinking, no, these are kids who are really angry and they're bullies and they're knocking people down in the middle of school days? No. Read the study carefully.
Right.
This is what education teaches us. This is what it's supposed to do. At its best, it teaches us to be careful consumers.
Right. Yeah. It requires just that bit of critical thinking where you kind of get in and look at the study, look at what it says, and you can't generalize some behaviors from putting hot sauce on somebody's food to,
being aggressive and starting physical altercations with people.
Right.
Those are two very different things.
And many people who have never studied research will say, "Oh, you can prove anything with statistics. Oh, you can prove anything with it." No, you can with a shoddy study. You can with shoddy, slipshod, messy research. Sure, you can do anything you want. We saw that with the autism and immunization studies. That was bad research.
Right.
And as soon as people took a look at it, but when you have a guy like Dr. Ferguson, who analyzes 101 studies that were carefully conducted, that's not shoddy research.
Right.
I mean, that's the kind of research that we should be doing. It's
Right.
careful, thoughtful.
Right.
And he selected 101 studies because they were worth studying.
Right.
So,
Yeah. So you have to get in and read the study and see what's going on. And when it comes down to, again, the idea of physical aggression, violence, and things like that, there just isn't a relationship.
We've never been able to establish a relationship.
Right.
Okay.
And we will continue research.
Right. You have to continue the studies. The research games continue to evolve, and now we have these first-person shooter games, which are relatively new. I guess they're the newest entry on the market, right?
And, yeah, I mean they've been around for a little while now, but to me also it not just that the research doesn't show a relationship. But I think that we get back to this numbers game, just like we did when we talked about mental health and mental illness the other day, and we were talking about, if there's 300 million people in the United States and 1% has schizophrenia, that's 3 million people with schizophrenia.
Right.
And we had,
400 shootings.
400 shootings, which is a lot of shootings, but an incredibly small proportion, and none of them had schizophrenia. Right. So it's, when we think about trying to blame mental illness, the same goes for video games.
Exactly. It's the same.
It's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Right.
Which means that millions of people are buying these video games. One would have to assume that if they're buying the video games, they're playing the video games. So if millions of people are playing the video games, once again, we only have maybe 400 shooters in any given year. The numbers just don't correlate.
You have a teenage son. You play video games? Violent video games? I have a son who played Call of Duty for a year. I mean, like every day.
Yeah.
He's never been a shooter.
Yeah.
He's not going to be a shooter.
Right.
Okay. But there's another interesting. That's one thing that millions of children are playing violent video games.
Right.
Millions of children are not aggressive. Okay. Let's look at it at a country. But think about this for a moment. And this is something that many people forget. Japan has video games. Japan has violent video games. The population of Japan is about 130 million. Okay. They had 10 shootings. The population of the United States is about 320, a little bit more than twice. We had 13,000 shootings. Now, we should have about 20, maybe 30 shootings. Okay.
Oh, you're just talking about shootings in general, not mass shootings.
Mass shootings. There were 10 in Japan.
Right.
Okay.
But
No, there were homicides. Gun-related homicides. Japan had 10. We had 13,000. Okay. It's not video game because Japan's teenagers play video games just the way Americans do. So they do in France, they do in England, they do in Sweden, they do in Scotland. All over the world, teenagers are playing video games. We don't have anywhere near, they don't have anywhere near the number of gun-related homicides that we do.
Right.
It's not the video games. If it was the video games, Japan should have about 6,000, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 shootings a year. Right. They have 10.
Yeah. So
they have the same. They listen to the same music. They play the same video games. They watch the same TV programs. Why the difference?
Right.
What's the difference in those countries?
Absolutely. So again, the main goal for today's podcast was to sort of dispel, hopefully, or hopefully begin the process of dispelling the myth that many of you may be carrying
Right.
as it relates to the relationship between violence and violent media,
Right.
whether it's movies or video games or whatever.
Yeah, and there is one other thing that we should say. Yes, there are students, there are children, there are teenagers who probably may react differently to violent video games. There are some, and we've had them as patients.
Sure.
Most kids will play video games. They'll become aroused naturally. I mean, just like adults do. Like you become a little bit aroused. Once the video game is over, it goes back down. There are some children who can't contain that arousal, okay? That they get so aroused that they do become more aggressive, or whatever word you want to use, violent, aggressive, because they can't contain. But it's not just with video games that they can't contain that arousal. They don't contain it at school. They don't contain it at parties. They don't contain it on athletic fields. Okay, it's the same. It's the same kids. So yes, there is a very tiny. But again, most of those are not going to be shooters.
Right.
Okay, so yes, there is this subgroup, and if your child is part of that subgroup, if you notice that your child becomes really, really unmanageable, then you need to monitor this a little more carefully. But millions of children don't. So
Right, and with that, the issue is that the way that you have to think about it is that aggressive, violent kids are drawn to violent, aggressive video games.
Right.
But so are non-violent, aggressive kids drawn to video games. But the reverse doesn't happen.
Right.
Violent and aggressive video games do not make otherwise passive kids
That's right.
become violent and aggressive.
And why don't girls do more? You know, we could get into the whole gender difference.
Right.
You know, girls don't play violent video games. It's not part of their nature. Okay.
Right.
So
And those that do, they don't become shooters.
They don't become shooters because most girls don't become shooters. So if the millions of girls who play violent video games don't become shooters.
Right.
Okay. So yes, I like the word myth. So it's a myth that mental illness is responsible for mass shootings. It is a myth that violent video games or TV or Hollywood or movies or anything are responsible for this, for mass shootings. Okay, mental illness is a myth. Violent video games is also a myth.
Right. Absolutely. So, all right.
So if we're going to solve the problem, let's look to the real reasons.
Let's not focus
Let's
there.
not chase myths around.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right, that's it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid. Thanks for sharing this episode of the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find all of our previous podcasts and much more. We would be honored if you would become a patron through patreon.com, where any donation you can manage will go to the development and creation of more content. Just visit patreon.com/thementalbreakdown for more information. Thanks again for listening. Have an awesome day, and we look forward to being back in your feed tomorrow morning.